This video is sponsored by Conflict of Nations, the free online PvP strategy game where you get to find out what it's like to take control of a real country and lead it in a modern global warfare. Set in the early 21st century, Conflict of Nations lets you take full control of a nation and find out what it's like to lead it in a modern global warfare. Fight up to 128 other players using everything from combat attack helicopters and airborne infantry units to stealth fighters and even nuclear ballistic submarines. You'll move your units across the map in real time, often taking hours to reach an objective, and game rounds can take weeks to complete, giving you the time to dive into a deep level of strategic planning and integrated tactical execution. That also means you have time to focus on my favorite part of the game, forging alliances and coalitions, which are essential if you want to win. But how you play is up to you. And best of all, you can play with the same account on both PC and mobile to never lose sight of your war. Infographics show viewers get a special gift of 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free when they use the link, but it's only available for 30 days. So click the link, choose a country, and start fighting your way to victory right now. A few years ago, if we talked about where you should or shouldn't be in the event of World War III, you might not have taken it very seriously. But in 2023, global war doesn't seem all that inconceivable. So who knows, in a few months you could be thinking about buying a plane ticket out of your soon-to-be smashed country. Listen carefully. This is where you don't want to be when it all kicks off. Number 15. We first need to set the scene for World War III to show you how realistic the possibility of it happening is. So, in the number 15 spot, we'll put the world in general. After all, World War III will affect just about every person in the world due to various disruptions. The week we started researching information for this video, the news media told us that the USA and its allies plan to provide F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine, whose position in the wrecked city of Bakhmut was also the focus of the global media that same week. Ukraine President Volodymyr Zelensky denied that Bakhmut was lost. Still, there was no doubt Russia was very close to completely occupying the city. Zelensky compared Bakhmut to the Japanese city of Hiroshima, which, as you know, along with Nagasaki, was hit with an American-made atom bomb at the end of World War II. When Zelensky said those words, he was attending the G7 summit actually in Hiroshima, where he cozied up to the G7 nations: Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the UK, and the US. Countries you'll hear more about later. The group discussed China's militarization activities in the Asia-Pacific region, to which China said it had been smeared by nations interfering in China's internal affairs. It was a busy week. As China dusted itself off from the verbal bashing, the Russian Foreign Minister Alexander Grushko talked about how that F-16 plan was all part of the West's escalation scenario. He said this route means colossal risks, and Russia would still achieve its aims in Ukraine anyway. Meanwhile, political scientists have talked about the global balance of power, and some say that the so-called unipolarity in the world, with the US as the sole superpower, the hegemon, is under threat as China and Russia seek to usher in a multipolar world, the way it was for centuries. Some theorists have said if the powers cannot reduce these tensions by embracing a new politics of détente, we'll walk into World War III and it will be world-crushing. Many pundits have seriously talked about an escalation in Ukraine. They say Russia and Ukraine cannot win outright, and if Russia feels threatened to close its borders, its tactical nuclear weapons might be pulled out. If this happens, the escalation train will scream choo-choo through clouds of thick, rancid nuclear fallout. As the Open Democracy Network said in April, most Kremlin watchers take the view that losing Crimea would be a defeat too far for Putin, and the risk of it could push Russia into a direct threat to go nuclear. National security experts, former diplomats, and military bigwigs in the U.S. belonging to the Eisenhower Media Network co-signed an open letter in May, stating future devastation could be exponentially greater as nuclear powers creep ever closer toward open war. They called Ukraine a new era of confrontation and slaughter that may well be our undoing. This is serious. If Russia uses tactical nuclear weapons, NATO will almost certainly respond, and if that happens, a global nuclear war is possible. Okay, so that's the setting for this show. Sure, it's one of our fictional disaster scenarios, but this is not a show about zombies or mega tsunamis. It's much more real than that. We aren't kidding around today. In this reality, we expect there to be two sides. The obvious one is the US and NATO, with China and Russia making up the lodestone of the enemy forces. Japan, India, Taiwan, Israel, Australia, and South Korea are on the side of NATO. Iran, Syria, possibly Pakistan, Belarus, and North Korea are on the side of Russia and China. It's hard to predict where all countries would get involved and where their alliances would stand if their regions became theaters of war. A lot of nations would want to stay neutral. Countries in South and Southeast Asia, South America, and Africa might indeed want no part of this Western war. It's hard to predict what'll happen since a global war, as we'll show you today, will affect every nation. This is why we put everywhere at the number 15 spot. Whether it's nuclear fallout, inability to import essential goods, or not getting much needed aid, you won't have to be invaded or directly hit with bombs to feel the presence of war on your doorstep. Nonetheless, some countries are going to get smacked in the face with either a hard right or a left uppercut, or worse, they're going to get their head completely knocked off. Number 14. Some countries wouldn't really have much of a chance in terms of fighting back in the event of World War III. They don't have large militaries or weapons of immense destruction to stage much of a fight. Such nations include Pacific Island nations, divided into Melanesia, Micronesia, and Polynesia. These islands have been and still are of great strategic importance in terms of security and defense. The Pacific Islands have been the focus of China for about a decade now, with many of these little nations receiving aid and means of development from China. In 2022, the Solomon Islands signed a controversial security pact with China. The US also has tried to cement relations with some of these nations, as has Australia. The war might not reach Australia and New Zealand, but it will reach the Pacific Islands. Everyone will want a military foothold in the Pacific. We don't know how it'll play out, but it might mean countries being swallowed up by their occupiers. They certainly won't be safe in World War III as they weren't in World War II. Number 13. As we said, a lot of countries will be indirectly affected by the war, and many of them will be in Africa. On this continent, China has spent billions of dollars on infrastructure projects. Sudan, Algeria, Nigeria, and Egypt all have close military ties with China. It's hard to say if war will break out between pro-China and pro-US nations in Africa, but if it did, the pro-China side would likely be bigger. Africa is a big place with 54 countries. It's hard to understand where alliances lie, but numerous polls as of late have shown a preference for China over the West. The continent is starting to rely on China more than it does on the West. In 2023, it was reported that South Africa held a joint military exercise with China and Russia. China wants to establish more naval power in the Indian Ocean. It's pushing its navy out there already, with ships located in various areas to combat piracy. But it might be about more than that. China wants a military presence in the region to protect its position in natural resource-rich Africa. Many African nations have given their support to China's claim on Taiwan. In 2022, the Chinese foreign minister said, China-Africa relations are the bedrock of China's foreign policy. China has a lot of friends in Africa, many of whom have voiced concern and criticism about the US's role in the Ukraine war. One thing you have to understand is that some African countries already have profound humanitarian crises. We can't mention them all because that would take up the entire show, but we'll still say that this is a major factor for why the African continent will be hit hard by a potential World War III. In 2022, it was reported that in the Central African Republic, around 3.1 million people were in need of humanitarian aid, while in Angola, 3.8 million people didn't have enough food to eat. In Nigeria, 4.4 million live with food insecurity, and in Burundi, 50% of kids under 5 are said to be malnourished. The indirect effect of a world war would be devastating for these already impoverished countries, many of whom might have had to take a side. The war so far in Ukraine has made matters so much worse. Hundreds of millions of people in Africa have been displaced, with many of the poorest seeking refuge in neighboring African countries, their lives hanging by a thread. So can you imagine how they'd fare if the world erupted into full-scale war? Still, there's no chance they'll be getting nuclear bombs dropped on them, and they're a long way from nuclear fallout. Number 12. Like some African nations, already unstable nations will also suffer indirectly through worsening humanitarian crises. One of these countries is Afghanistan, which, according to humanitarian organizations in 2023, was at very real risk of systemic collapse and human catastrophe. Afghanistan's population is about 40 million people, and it's reported that 28.3 million of them currently need humanitarian assistance. The country is suffering, even though it's already receiving hundreds of millions in humanitarian assistance. A spokesperson for the UN in the country said in 2023 that the fate of the entire generation of Afghans is at stake. If there's a World War III, the country will be on the brink of collapse, and the war will very likely push it over the edge. We're not sure if the billions it receives in aid from all over the world, including China and the US, will be there any longer. This might not seem important to you, but it could mean millions of deaths. It is important. The same goes for Yemen. where American weapons, intelligence, and training have helped Saudi Arabia to destroy infrastructure and civilian life. The UK and France can also take a bow for creating this river of blood in Yemen. We won't go into all the details, but millions of innocent people have been displaced. At the same time, in 2023, it was reported that 23.4 million people would need humanitarian aid, while 17.4 million are looking at acute food insecurity. There has been lots of humanitarian assistance, but again, World War III would put an end to that. As a result, many would die. Syria is also struggling, with reports now saying that things have become much worse in this country after Russia invaded Ukraine. It said 65% of the people in Syria now face food insecurity. 3 million people have been displaced in a country that has only just over 18 million people. The EU has managed to put together a 27.4 billion euro package to support the Syrians who most need it. But if the Ukraine war so far can do this much damage, what will happen when World War III comes around? And then you have Venezuela, which is also facing a humanitarian crisis and is in dire need of aid. South America might be one of the best places to be in World War III, but in Venezuela, it's said 90% of people now live in poverty, while close to 7 million have been forced to leave. A world war would make things so much worse. In many nations where life is already tough, more and more people would arm themselves. Chaos would reign as more arms made their way into criminals' hands. Society could collapse. It would take too long to go through all the vulnerable nations of the world and how not receiving aid would cripple them. These are just a few examples, but trust us, many nations not even remotely taking part in World War III would see large parts of their population suffer and possibly starve. This would not just be a war about weapons. The explosions where the battles take place would ripple out like a giant lake of fire, engulfing the poorest parts of the planet. But now let's get down to business and talk about where the direct action would take place. Number 10. Israel, Iran, Saudi Arabia. This one is tricky, so let's just say the region, already a bit unstable, could become much more unstable if World War III arrived. Israel is a very strong ally of the US, but also has very close ties to Russia, which is why it's maintained a hands-off approach in the Ukraine war. Iran and Israel get along about as well as Tom and Jerry, which could be problematic in a world war. Iran is certainly the US's enemy. Saudi Arabia has close ties with the US. You also have Iraq. Despite a war-crimey US-UK-led invasion that killed hundreds of thousands of people, Iraq and the US are now strategic partners. Iran and Iraq also have fairly good relations right now. That doesn't mean things won't kick off in this embattled region. Israel already has nuclear weapons, although we don't know how many. Iran doesn't have them yet, but its program could be sped up when its good friend Russia is under attack in a global war. You also have to remember that Israel and Saudi Arabia rely on food imports about as much as any other nation. In 2020, Israeli media reported Israel is dangerously unprepared for global food shortages. Saudi Arabia would also struggle as global supply chains face disruption in World War III. Such chaos can lead to conflict. As for actual military involvement, though, it's very hard to say what would happen in the Middle East since US, Russia, and China relations are complicated there. Israel, we think, would feel quite insecure since Iran might take advantage of the situation as the US fights battles elsewhere. Still, many countries in the Middle East consider Ukraine a far-off war. As that war has raged on, the US has tried to isolate Russia in the Middle East and elsewhere, but has mostly failed. Russia has been busy making energy deals, building nuclear plants, conducting arms sales, and putting together summits in the Middle East. Countries such as Egypt and the UAE need Russia for trade. China and Saudi Arabia just completed a big oil deal, and journalists are now asking if China can replace the US in the Middle East. That is doubtful considering the US's security arrangements in the regions, but Russia still has potential allies in the region. The Middle East might want to stay out of World War III, but whether that's possible is another matter. This one's hard to call, but today we're not trying to speculate exactly what would happen in World War III. We just want to know where we would rather not be. We'd also prefer not to be in these next two countries if World War III kicked off. Number 9. India and Pakistan. It's a hard call to say if they'd get involved in World War III, but you can't ignore the fact these two nations are nuclear powers. They're under no obligation to fight, but having those weapons might mean something in World War III. These days, like many countries around the world, India doesn't want to look too friendly with the US in terms of opposition to China. It's certainly not taking an anti-China stance, and it hasn't joined the sanctions in Russia. Around 50% of India's arms imports from 2016 to 2020 came from Russia. India is a part of BRICS, what's sometimes called a rival to G7 countries. They are Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. While China's leader Xi Jinping visited Putin not long ago, he started talking about a new global order, a multipolar order, where the US is no longer the hegemon. India was mentioned as being part of the new order. In terms of Ukraine, Pakistan has, like India, remained neutral. So again, this is a difficult call. Neither India nor Pakistan has a dog in the Ukraine war. Then why aren't we saying we wouldn't want to be here when the big fight kicks off? Well, just because they are two nuclear powers, and in war, countries might not have the choice to remain neutral. India and Pakistan also have been at each other's throats for decades, ever since the British partition of India. It's unclear just how many warheads Pakistan has, but it's thought the number is close to 200. Some sources say less, some say slightly more. It's estimated the weapons range from 5 to 12 kilotons, although some of the country's longer-range ballistic missiles might be in the 40 kiloton range. Its F-16 combat aircraft and Mirage 3 and 5 aircraft can launch conventional and nuclear strikes. At the same time, it has nuclear-capable short to medium-range ballistic missiles and has seen some recent developments in cruise missile capabilities. As of 2022, India operates 8 different nuclear-capable systems. 2 of them are aircraft, 4 of them are land-based ballistic missiles, and 2 are sea-based ballistic missiles. Both countries are capable of causing extreme damage to each other. Again, it's hard to believe that they would go to war, but anything could happen in World War III. Who knows how trade will be upset, how economies will suffer, and how a disagreement could spin out of control. India and Pakistan might have to pick a side. And what if they end up on opposite sides? These two nations will not be a good place to be when the world decides to implode. But you can be sure these next 2 countries will be a worse place to live. Number 8. If World War III broke out, 2 places we would rather not be are North and South Korea. China is the Hermit Kingdom's biggest trading partner. If there were a global war, North Korea would be on the side of China and Russia. It would actively join in, perhaps using its weapons to attack the South and even the USA. In 2022, North Korea announced that it recognized the independence of the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics in eastern Ukraine. The country has offered to help Russia in terms of manpower and also shells and rockets. When the UN condemned Russia's invasion of Ukraine at the start of the war, North Korea was one of the 5 nations that didn't sign the non-binding resolution of condemnation. The other countries were Russia, of course, Belarus, Syria, and Eritrea. In March 2023, North Korea boasted about its tactical nuclear weapons that could be fitted on short-range missiles and fired into South Korea. The country even simulated nuclear attacks on Seoul. We should add that we can't know if the country's nuclear capabilities are what it says they are, but who would want to second guess? North Korea's nuclear arsenal is a bit of a mystery, but tests have shown the country's nukes could certainly reach Japan and South Korea. The RAND Corporation projects that by 2027, North Korea will have stockpiled around 200 nuclear weapons, similar to the number that France and the UK have. Countries we'll discuss soon. We also know that North Korea has very powerful intercontinental ballistic missiles, which in theory could strike about as far as the US mainland. While the country is dirt poor, it has the world's 4th largest military and about 1.2 million personnel. It might also have a stock of highly dangerous chemical and biological weapons. If there's a world war, North Korea might soon swoop down into South Korea. Sure, the South would receive help, but that doesn't mean it'll be a safe place to live if hostilities kick off. The North, where so many people live in poverty and where infrastructure is plainly terrible, would also suffer tremendously. Again, we aren't going to guess how this would work out, but we'll just say we wouldn't want to be in either of these countries if the planet was eclipsed by war. Number 7. Neither would we want to be in Taiwan, which would very likely soon lose its independence after a successful Chinese attack. In the recent Pentagon leaks that told us Ukraine was struggling to get a spring offensive together, we also could see that US intelligence believes China would soon have air superiority over Taiwan in such an attack. Xi Jinping often boasts about the strength and modernization of the People's Liberation Army of China, which is said to be 14 times bigger than Taiwan's forces. Taiwan would struggle to hold off China, but anyway, in the event of World War III, it's just probably not where you want to be, even if it could hold off China. This next country would also struggle with China. Number 6. China and Japan have a long and complicated history. In the Second World War, Japan did things inside China that rivaled Hitler's atrocities in Europe. During China's so-called 100 Years of Humiliation, Japan surprised the European powers when it was victorious against China in the First Sino War. China had been the world's superpower for centuries, and yet it failed to modernize its military, and slowly but surely its power waned during the era. Since that time, China said many times never again, hence it's updated its military and Japan can feel the heat. No surprise then that Japan is very friendly with the US and other Western powers right now. After World War II, Japan was reduced to a shadow of its former military prowess, but these days, its defense capabilities have been bolstered. The country also has very close ties with the US and Europe. In 2022, Japan signed defense agreements with the US, Australia, and the UK. These countries together condemned Russia. That year, Japan announced a huge increase in military spending, which will see its military strength vastly improving over the next decade. In fact, Western media outlets talked about Japan gearing up for war with China, what Bloomberg called a revolution in Japanese statecraft. The Japanese Prime Minister is not happy about China's activity in the Taiwan Strait. He recently warned that East Asia might end up looking like Ukraine in the near future. Such words could have been written by the US president's speechwriters. It's no surprise at all, given Japan's history with China, that the nation has thrown its sword into the ring with the West. Given what we've just said about North Korea, an attack by North Korea and China together would certainly cause a mess in Japan comparable to the mess the US caused almost 80 years ago. As you know, Japan's destruction involved a lot of intense bombing raids prior to the nukes, and it never backed down. Had those nukes not been dropped, Japan would very likely have fought off a land invasion with every last person throwing everything they had at the US. The devastation would have been absolutely terrible. It's estimated that there would have been between 1.7 to 4 million US casualties, anywhere from 400 to 800,000 US dead, and between 5 to 10 million Japanese deaths. What does that tell you about Japanese resilience? It wouldn't bow down to China in a new war, but China does have a much better military, and unlike Japan, it has nuclear weapons. So no, we wouldn't want to be in Japan for World War III. Number 5. What about the UK? A country that undoubtedly used to rule the waves when its empire literally stretched all over the world. This tiny island, 3 times smaller than Texas, could fit inside of 11 different US states. It used to be like an empire on steroids, bolstered by baked beans, strong tea, and fish finger buddies. No, we're kidding about that last part, but Britain does have quite an exceptional military history. Napoleon failed against the Brits, and the Nazis also failed, mainly because attacking Britain by land would have been an uphill task for any country. How things have changed. The UK is also a shadow of its former self where the military is concerned. It would be vulnerable in World War III, but it would have to go on the attack. Britain is the US's closest ally, even closer than Canada, that's right next door. The US's other closest allies are Germany, Japan, and South Korea. The UK has the smallest stock of nuclear warheads out of China, France, Russia, the UK, and the US. It's believed Britain could have about 260, of which maybe 120 are operationally ready for deployment on the UK's 4 Vanguard-class nuclear-powered ballistic missile subs. Only one of them is currently at sea, carrying 40 warheads. The UK calls this its continuous at-sea deterrent. Britain still has a very strong military, even though the days of empire building are a distant dream. Even so, it's arguably a top 5 military behind India, China, Russia, and the US, at least according to global firepower. In a World War scenario, it would still be almost impossible to invade by land, but no one would try that. Russia, which we'll discuss very soon, has the largest nuclear arsenal in the world. It has at least 15 bases from where it could launch a nuclear strike at the UK. If you've picked up a British tabloid newspaper or looked online at tabloid news over the last few years, these fear-inducing media outlets would have told you that Putin has nuclear weapons that could cause giant 1,000-foot-high tsunamis to hit Britain, which would possibly create a nuclear holocaust on the island. You sometimes have to take the tabloids with a pinch of salt. But there is no doubt that they have a point about massive nuclear missiles launched from one of Russia's submarines being able to wreak havoc on such a small and densely populated nation. A strike on London with its 9 million people, a center of finance and culture, would be devastating. There are large industrial centers in the north, not too far from each other, some being Manchester, Liverpool, Leeds, and Sheffield. The nuclear fallout would quickly penetrate these cities. There aren't too many places you could go in Britain to escape from the doom. 46% of its food is imported. Many people would go hungry. This is far from a self-sufficient nation. It would not fare well at all in a world war. But unlike these next nations, at least it's hard to invade. Number 4. Many other countries in Europe, those currently in the EU, are not as impregnable as Britain. France, one of those countries, is another nuclear power with around 300 nuclear warheads, most of which are submarine-launched ballistic missiles. It also has nuclear-capable cruise missiles for its fighter aircraft. France has 4 nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines, as well as 40 Rafale Bf-3 land-based aircraft and 10 Rafale MF-3s carrying nuclear warheads. France maintains a strict sufficiency policy, which means its nuclear weapons should only be used in extreme circumstances when its safety and security are threatened. But let's face it, if nuclear weapons really start to fly, we don't know how countries would react. Screw the policies, they might think, when they see noxious mushroom clouds hanging over cities like murderous mythological beasts. All countries have various policies about their nukes, but sometimes they are purposefully ambiguous. No one knows what'll happen if the world's nuclear powers went to war. The United States and Russia don't even have a no first use policy. Israel doesn't even admit to having nukes. As things stand, the nuclear world, you might say, is multipolar. When it was unipolar, the US thought about using them in China and later in Vietnam. Since other powers got them, we've had a stalemate. And once they start going off, mutually assured destruction will likely follow. While most of Europe supports Ukraine, different nations on the continent have thrown more or less effort into supporting Ukraine. The UK is obviously way more on the warpath than most other countries, but as we said, the UK usually does what the US wants it to do. France has much more independence. It's also bound by NATO's principles of collective defense, but we're not sure it would be as gung-ho about nuclear war as the US and the UK if Russia used nukes against Ukraine. It's hard to know how other European nations will feel about it and what they'll commit to and support. Germany, Poland, Estonia, and the Netherlands all have heavily supported Ukraine, and many other nations offered their support. In contrast, nations such as Slovakia, Bulgaria, and Hungary, all in NATO, have different, less caustic attitudes towards Russia. Some politicians in Europe see the Ukraine war as a proxy war between Russia and the US, with Ukraine caught in the middle, but if this war escalates, we still don't really know what'll happen. What we do know is that another controversial war across Europe would be much more devastating than the wars at the start of the 20th century, just because the weapons we have today are so much more powerful. World War III would also be a much more technological war, with hacking digital infrastructure playing a big role. We just don't think being in the middle of this small continent would be a good place to be. But neither would a few thousand miles to the west. Number 3. The US, far from Europe, next to a good friend in Canada and a less conventional buddy in Mexico, would not have a threat on its borders. If World War III happened, though, there would be chaos in the US. There's no doubt about that. It could take many forms, maybe even organized crime outfits in Mexico, well armed as they already are, would cause havoc. The US is such a polarized nation too, so who knows what'll happen internally if it all goes off and the nukes land in the US. The US has an anti-nuclear weapon defense system, the ground-based mid-course defense, which would take out nuclear missiles, although when you hear such a task has been called, like trying to hit a bullet with a bullet, it doesn't exactly instill much trust. If there was an all-out nuclear war, the US would get hit. There is absolutely no doubt about that. In 2022, the American Physical Society released a 54-page report saying US defenses wouldn't even be able to stop the nukes from North Korea, never mind China or Russia. The report added that the US's current capabilities are low and will likely continue to be low for the next 15 years. No one knows which cities would be hit first, but it's likely New York, Chicago, Houston, Los Angeles, San Francisco, or Washington, D.C. would all be contenders. These cities are not ready for a nuclear attack, according to various experts. One professor recently told the press there isn't a single jurisdiction in America that has anything approaching an adequate plan to deal with a nuclear detonation. Not long ago, a public service announcement was released by New York City officials, in which a lady explained that the big one had hit. Her advice was go inside, stay away from the windows, and have a wash. She added, don't forget to watch TV and go online to catch up with what's going down outside. It's such a pity the residents of Hiroshima and Nagasaki didn't have that kind of information at their fingertips just before they were vaporized. A large nuke hitting New York would kill a large part of the city's population immediately. It could bring down the Empire State Building, Madison Square Garden, Penn Central Railroad Station, the New York Public Library. The blast wave would bring down more buildings. A 1,000-foot fireball would rage through the streets. Buildings would collapse further out as the thermal pulse obliterated humans. Maybe 300,000 would die in the next few seconds. As the blast was spread, hundreds of thousands of more people would die. Many would cling to life, but with mild to severe radiation sickness. Many of those would die over the next few days or weeks, horrible, agonizing deaths. Maybe 1 million would die, and 1 million would suffer their injuries. New York would be in pieces, so yes, we doubt following that advice by going inside, laying on the couch with a cup of coffee in your hand, while surfing TV channels would be of much use. You can't wash off a 150-kiloton nuclear explosion. It's not like spilling wine on your new shirt. Many analysts say Russia now beats the US in terms of its nuclear arsenal. We'll talk about that soon, but for now, let's just say the US would get hit and hit badly. Millions would die in attacks, but the nuclear fallout would get many more as chaos reigned in the attacked cities and beyond. The weapon we used in our New York City scenario was 150 kilotons. It said Russia has nukes with yields of around 300 and 800 kilotons. The US has close to 5,400 nuclear warheads, with about 1,600 of them deployed. This includes 400 Minuteman III ICBMs and 450 operational launchers. These have a yield of between 170 to 335 kilotons. Numbers concerning deployed nukes, stockpiled nukes, and retired nukes are always changing. Just recently, a report said the US has 1,419 deployed nuclear warheads. The US would want to use them to prevent an attack on itself, so escalation would likely spin out of control very fast. The US's nuclear capabilities are diverse, with the country having 14 nuclear-capable Ohio-class Trident submarines, 9 of which right now are in the Pacific and 5 in the Atlantic. The US also has 60 nuclear-capable heavy bombers, 20 B-2 bombers, and 40 B-52s, as well as 240 UGM-133A Trident II D5 submarine-launched ballistic missiles on 14 Ohio-class nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines. It's said the U.S. has 800 delivery systems or thereabouts. Recent reports say the country is spending $1 billion on a new nuclear missile that will be able to travel 6,000 miles, carrying a warhead with a yield of around 300 kilotons. The plan is to make 600 of them over the next few years, and like with all big military powers, the U.S. will have a lot of firepower up its sleeves. If the country is hit with a nuclear weapon, we'll be looking at a possible nuclear holocaust on our planet. And all that talk you hear about the U.S. turning its back on biological and chemical weapons, you can be sure is just that, talk. The U.S. has always been a leader in this regard, even though it has often been keeping it top secret. It's a leader because it fears, rightly fears, China and Russia are developing their own horrifying biological and chemical weapons. The Cold War might have ended, but it's highly doubtful the biggest military powers have just given up research on such weapons. To be sure, the UN has said the United Nations is not aware of any biological weapons programs, but let's see what people say about that in 50 years. They will be horrified by the secret and nasty weapons the big powers are now developing, just as we're horrified about what the US and Soviet Union are doing decades ago. So, if the US were hit with a nuke, it would be, as the famous REM song says, the end of the world as we know it, but we would not feel fine. Number 2. As we told you, China will have its own secret biological weapons program, as will Russia. These two nations and the US would release biological and chemical hell. China also has nukes, maybe about 400 of them, although there's a lot of speculation about China's nukes. In 2023, Defense News reported the US may no longer enjoy a numerical advantage against China in certain elements of its intercontinental ballistic missile program, according to Strategic Command, which oversees the US nuclear arsenal. It was said that China now has 300 intercontinental ballistic missiles and launchers, which is fewer than the US. However, the report noted that China's Dongfeng 41 missile can carry multiple warheads, so 300 missiles could get you slightly over 400 warheads. China also has short and medium-range missiles, while China's in-class nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines can carry up to 12 submarine-launched ballistic missiles. On top of this, there is China's H-6N nuclear-capable bomber. The country's nuclear capabilities are said to be growing at a fast rate too. Not to mention China's other military strengths. It might not be a country with much military experience, but in terms of manpower and equipment, it's certainly a force to be reckoned with. China's Navy, according to various US sources, will soon outgrow the US Navy. But today we're mostly talking about where we wouldn't want to be, and China is one of those countries. Like the US, it would almost be impossible to invade China by land successfully. The country is pretty much the same size as the US and just as diverse in terms of terrain. Some say even more diverse. It would be a nightmare to invade China by land. So the war would turn nuclear, millions upon millions of Chinese people packed into its largest cities would die, and the nuclear fallout, not to mention the chaos caused by infrastructure damage and disruptions in trade, would cause hell on the so-called Middle Kingdom. At the same time, all the countries that rely on Chinese trade would suffer. Just imagine our New York City scenario, but with many millions more people. Now for the last one, which is pretty obvious. Number 1. The nations that would suffer the most are Ukraine and Russia. We're putting these countries together because they are currently at war with each other. Ukraine has already been invaded, but if things escalate, Russia could easily be invaded by a NATO force consisting of the militaries of many powerful European nations and of course the US. Unlike China and the US, Russia would likely become occupied. But before that happened, the Americans would launch a nuclear attack. Much of Russia is barely inhabited, so the attacks would concentrate on Moscow, home to 10% of Russia's entire population, at about 13 million, 21.5 million residents in the metropolitan area. St. Petersburg has a population of about 5 million. Much of Russia is controlled in these centers. Even though it's much bigger than the US, there is less to aim for in terms of big cities. Russia has around 5,400 nuclear weapons, with around 1,644 of them deployed. In the 1960s, it detonated the biggest nuclear bomb ever made, the Tsar Bomba, which was said to be 50 megatons and damaged buildings as far away as 500 miles. The force of the explosion was 1,500 times bigger than that of the bomb that hit Hiroshima. It doesn't have one of those now, but it does have some terrifying weapons of mass destruction. Its RS-28 Sarmats long-range ballistic missiles can carry up to 10 large nuclear warheads and travel 11,000 miles, and they're a force of nature. In 2023, Russia said 50 new Satan-2 RS-28 Sarmat SSX-30s would soon be ready for combat. Russia might have about 1,600 warheads deployed at missile and bomber bases and on submarines. About 2,900 more are active, making Russia the biggest hitter in terms of nuclear weapons, and it has 6 missile fields: Domborovsky, Kartale, Kozelsk, Taitishevo, Uzhur, and Alesk. Russia also has nuclear missile submarines patrolling the naval bases of Dneprychya, Yagilnaya, and Rabachi. Its nuclear bombers are stationed at Ukrainka and Engels air bases. Russia's cities might be destroyed, but its nukes would find their target. As we mentioned earlier, some of those are quite capable of killing hundreds of thousands or more people in just one strike. Though it's thought some of them have a yield of around 500 kilotons, though Russia might have some in the 1,000 kiloton range, which is quite insane. The country has about 1,900 tactical nukes, 1,185 intercontinental ballistic missiles, 800 sub-launch ballistic missiles, and 580 air-launched warheads from bombers. Again, the numbers change depending on the source because the exact number is guesswork. The first use of nukes would be in Ukraine, with smaller tactical nukes, possibly Russia's 9K-720 Iskander missile system. These might not have the power of the bomb that hit Hiroshima, but these 5-kiloton bombs would still cause a lot of damage and would spread radiation poisoning and radioactive debris all over the place. Tens of thousands of citizens have already died in Ukraine, not to mention military casualties that have likely been underreported for both Ukraine and Russia. You can only imagine the devastation in Ukraine if nukes were used. The country's already lost thousands of buildings, bridges, roads, and houses, costing perhaps $300 to $500 billion. You wouldn't want to be in Ukraine right now, never mind if the war becomes World War III, and when that happens, you can be sure Russia would immediately be hit back. So you really wouldn't want to be in Russia either, especially not in the populated areas in European Russia. These two nations would be ground zero of the war. But if things escalated from there, the countries we've already mentioned would also be places you certainly wouldn't want to be. A recent Princeton simulation study concluded that if Russia and NATO did get into a nuclear war, hitting the 30 most populated centers with 5 to 10 nukes would result in about 34 million deaths within 45 minutes. Possibly another 57 million would be injured, millions with possibly fatal injuries. Seems like a low estimate to us, but what is certain is tens or even hundreds of millions will die in the next year from their injuries, sickness, or due to nuclear fallout, and as we said earlier, disruptions to trade and aid. Russia's few population centers would take a hammering. But so would many of our historic cities. Conventional war would follow, which would look like something from a dystopian movie as militaries try to finish people off among the radioactive rubble, people who never wanted war and had no beef with each other. A nuclear winter is possible, which would mean the collapse of civilization as we know it, and a little ice age lasting thousands of years. Let's just hope World War III doesn't happen. In terms of the Earth's resume, when there's an intergalactic planetary meeting at the center of the universe in the future, having mutually assured destruction in 2023 written in the experience section won't be a good look. Thanks again to our sponsor Conflict of Nations, the free online PvP strategy game happening in a modern global warfare. Get a special gift of 13,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free by using the link. It's only available for 30 days, so don't wait. Choose your country and start fighting your way to victory right now. Now you need to watch Last Thing You See Before a Nuclear Bomb Explodes, or have a look at our fictional nuclear epic, I Survived 1,000 Days of Nuclear War, full movie.